July 4, 1943. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The first trainload of German prisoners crossed through the gates on Independence Day, a date thick with irony that nobody seemed to notice. They stumbled off the railcars after 6 days of transport. From the North African coastmen who'd survived the crushing defeat at Tunisia, the final collapse of the Afrika Korps, the desperate last stand against overwhelming Allied firepower. For nearly a week, they'd eaten nothing but watery cabbage soup. Now they stood in the Kansas summer heat, squinting at barbed wire and guard towers, waiting for what came next. Most expected hard labor, brutal treatment, the kind of camps they'd heard stories about. What they didn't expect was what the American guards told them within the first hour. You'll be given hot showers, clean uniforms, and dinner will be served at 1800 hours. One prisoner later recalled the moment with perfect clarity. We thought it was a trick, some kind of psychological game before the real punishment began. But there was no trick. That evening, when German soldiers who'd spent months scrounging for scraps in the North African desert sat down to their first meal in American captivity, the plates that arrived contained scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, hot coffee, and fruit. Real fruit. Some men stared at their plates without moving. Others wept openly. By the war's end, over 425,000 German prisoners would pass through more than 700 camps. Spread across the United States, the largest prisoner relocation in American history. They would work on farms, build fences, harvest wheat, and pick asparagus. They would attend university courses, form orchestras, play soccer, and watch American movies. They would earn wages, send letters home, and encounter a version of America that shattered every piece of propaganda they'd been fed about their enemies. This is the story of how German soldiers confronted American abundance on a scale they couldn't comprehend. How young men from Hamburg and Munich discovered that their captors lived in a world so different from their own that it seemed to belong to a different century. And how the simple experience of hot coffee and fresh bread changed the way thousands of enemy combatants viewed the war and the nation that held them prisoner. But before we understand what happened inside those camps, we need to understand where these men came from and why what they found in America shocked them to their core. Let's go back to May 1943, Tunisia, the last stronghold of Axis forces in North Africa. For months, General Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been pushed steadily backward by combined British and American forces. Supply lines were cut, fuel was scarce, food was scarcer. When the end came, it came fast. On May 13, 1943, roughly 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered in northern Tunisia. It was the largest Axis capitulation of the war to that point. Among them were hardened veterans who'd fought across the desert for 2 years, young conscripts who'd barely fired a shot, tank crews without tanks, and officers without units to command. The Allies faced an immediate problem. What do you do with 250,000 prisoners when you're fighting a war across 2 continents? Britain was already struggling with prison capacity. Keeping that many POs in North Africa meant diverting resources from the push into Sicily in Italy. The solution, controversial at the time, was to ship them across the Atlantic to the continental United States, far from the fighting, far from any hope of liberation, and into a country with land and labor needs that suddenly aligned with a massive influx of able-bodied men. The first ships departed in late May, 1943. The prisoners traveled in cramped conditions aboard Liberty ships, the same vessels that carried tanks and ammunition to Europe now carried its soldiers in the opposite direction. Most of the journey, they received minimal rations. The crossing took 2 to 3 weeks. Men who'd grown accustomed to the desert heat found themselves shivering in Atlantic storms, crammed into holds designed for cargo, not humans. But here's what matters. These men weren't just soldiers. They were products of a Germany that by 1943 was starving. Did you know that by mid-1943, the average German civilian was consuming 20% less bread, 60% less meat, and 40% less fat than they had at the war's start? The Nazi regime had implemented increasingly strict rationing. Potatoes and black bread formed the bulk of most diets. Coffee was made from roasted barley or chicory root, a bitter substitute that bore little resemblance to the real thing. Meat appeared on tables once a week if you were lucky. Sugar was a distant memory. For German soldiers, conditions were often worse. On the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht units routinely went days with inadequate rations. Supply convoys were disrupted by partisan attacks and the sheer impossible distances of the Russian interior. In North Africa, Rommel's men had grown thin and desperate, supplementing their meager supplies with captured British rations. When they could get them by the time these men boarded ships for America, many hadn't had a proper meal in months. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a completely different world waited. America in 1943 was facing its own challenges. Certainly, rationing had been introduced for sugar, coffee, meat, and gasoline. Citizens carried ration books and complained about shortages. But shortage in America meant something fundamentally different than Shortage in Europe. An American family might be frustrated that they could only buy 2 pounds of coffee per month instead of unlimited amounts. A German family was boiling tree bark. An American farmer might grumble about fuel quotas. A German soldier ate watery soup for 6 straight days. The scale of American agricultural and industrial output was so vast that even with rationing, even with millions of men overseas, the country produced more food per capita than Germany could dream of supplying to its population. American farms were mechanized in ways German farms weren't. The United States had access to resources from an entire hemisphere. There was no Eastern Front draining manpower, no Allied bombers hitting factories and rail lines daily. This disparity, this fundamental difference in material reality would become the defining shock for German prisoners arriving on American soil. But there was another factor that would shape their experience, something written into international law 3 years before the war began. The Geneva Convention of 1929. The convention established strict protocols for the treatment of prisoners of war. POWs must be housed in conditions comparable to base troops of the capturing nation. They must receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They could not be subjected to torture, humiliation, or degrading treatment. Officers could not be compelled to work. Enlisted men could work, but only if compensated and only in roles not directly supporting the war effort. The United States, despite the controversial decision to use POW labor extensively, largely adhered to these protocols. This wasn't pure altruism. American officials believed that German treatment of American PSOs held in German camps would directly mirror how the U.S. treated German prisoners. Reciprocity became policy. So, when the War Department established the network of camps across the United States, eventually growing to 175 main camps and 511 branch camps in 46 states, they built them to Geneva standards, which meant building them to standards far above what most of these German soldiers had ever experienced. Even in peacetime, the camps went up quickly. Former civilian conservation corps facilities were converted. Military bases added POW compounds. Rural areas with labor shortages welcomed the construction. By summer 1943, as the first prisoners arrived, the infrastructure was ready, but nobody, not the American commanders, not the German prisoners, not the farmers who would eventually hire them, fully understood what was about to happen when these two worlds collided. What happened when young men raised in Coldwater Flats in Hamburg encountered American small-town abundance? When soldiers who'd spent years under Nazi propaganda about the decadent, weak Americans saw the reality with their own eyes? When men who'd been told they were part of the master race found themselves treated with a basic human dignity they'd rarely experienced, even from their own military? The story that unfolded in those camps would reshape how thousands of German soldiers understood the war they'd been fighting and the nation they'd been told to hate. The first meal changed everything. At Camp Concordia, one of the largest facilities, eventually holding over 4,000 prisoners, the pattern established on that July 4th became standard. Breakfast typically included scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with real butter, coffee made from actual coffee beans, and fruit. Lunch might be sandwiches with cold cuts, vegetables, soup. Dinner featured meat, pork chops, chicken, occasionally beef alongside potatoes, bread, and more vegetables than most of these men had seen in months. The flour contract for Camp Concordia alone exceeded the entire German supply that had been available to trapped forces at Stalingrad the previous winter. Let that sink in. One Kansas POW camp used more flour than one of the largest German armies in the field. A prisoner named Klaus Hubner, who'd been captured with the 15th Panzer Division, later wrote home, "I have gained 14 kilograms in 3 months. My uniform no longer fits. They gave me a new one." The weight gain was universal. Medical examinations showed that the average POW gained 15 to 20 pounds in their first few months of captivity. Men who'd arrived gaunt, with hollowed cheeks and protruding ribs, began to look healthy for the first time since the war began. But it wasn't just the quantity of food, it was the quality, and more importantly, the casualness of it all. American guards ate the same food. There was no special officers' mess with better rations. The kitchen staff wasn't hoarding supplies. What the prisoners received, the guards received, and both received more than most German civilians back home could imagine. One Gunter Gerg, captured at age 18, remembered his astonishment. "We thought surely this was temporary, that they were fattening us up for something." But week after week, the meals never diminished. There was always enough, always more if you wanted it. We couldn't understand where it all came from. Where it came from was the same place everything in America came from in 1943, an industrial and agricultural machine operating on a scale Germany simply couldn't match. Did you know that American farmers were paid 45 cents per hour by the government for each POW laborer they employed? The prisoners themselves received 80 cents per day, paid in camp scrip, not cash, which could be spent only in the camp canteen. What did that canteen sell? Cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing paper. small luxuries, but the very existence of those luxuries, available for purchase with earned wages, represented something most prisoners had never encountered in the German military: the assumption that soldiers would have disposable income for non-essentials. The work itself varied wildly depending on location. In Nebraska, POWs like those who worked on Mel Luchin's family farm near Murdoch helped with corn harvesting, hay baling, and fence building. In Wisconsin, they harvested sugar beets and worked in canneries. In Texas and California, they picked cotton and citrus fruit. In Pennsylvania and New York, they worked in mills and factories producing non-military goods. Under Geneva Convention rules, POWs could not be forced into work directly supporting the war effort. No ammunition manufacturing, no weapon assembly, no military construction, but agriculture infrastructure. That was permissible and desperately needed. America faced a critical labor shortage. Millions of young men had been drafted. Farm production had to increase to feed both the military and the civilian population, plus provide supplies to allied nations. The POS filled that gap, but here's where things get interesting, and where American civilians started to get uncomfortable. The prisoners weren't just well-fed and paid. They had access to amenities that sometimes exceeded what Americans themselves enjoyed. Camp newspapers were published, often in German. Sports leagues formed. Soccer was wildly popular, with elaborate tournaments between camps. Theater groups performed German plays. Musical ensembles gave concerts. Education programs offered courses in everything from English to engineering. Some camps established what prisoners ironically called universities, the University of Houston in Texas, for example, where POWs taught each other advanced subjects and issued mimeograph degrees. At Fort Robinson in Nebraska, the camp even had a swimming pool. Hans Wept, a POW at Fort Robinson, who later returned to the United States as a physician after the war, recalled, "We called it a golden cage. We were prisoners, yes, but our lives were more comfortable than they had been even before the war. Many of us had grown up in cold water flats with outdoor toilets. Here we had hot showers, flush toilets, heated barracks in winter. It was extraordinary." Movies were shown regularly, usually not current films, but entertainment nonetheless. Some camps held dances. A few even organized social events with local communities, though this was controversial and often led to unauthorized fraternization between prisoners and American women. Which brings us to the backlash. American civilians, particularly those with family members serving overseas, began to resent what they perceived as coddling of the enemy. Why were German prisoners eating meat 3 times a week when American civilians were rationed to £1 per person? Why did POWs have access to recreational facilities when American soldiers were fighting and dying? The complaints reached Congress. Local newspapers ran editorials questioning the lavish treatment. Some communities near camps organized protests. The military's response was consistent. Geneva Convention compliance protected American POS held in Germany. Treating German prisoners well encouraged better treatment of Americans. It was strategic, not sentimental. But there was another, less discussed, reason for the good treatment. Psychological warfare. The U.S. military's Special Projects Division ran an extensive re-education program inside POW camps designed to combat Nazi ideology and expose prisoners to democratic values. This program included screened films, selected reading materials, lectures, and carefully orchestrated interactions with German-speaking Americans who could present alternative perspectives. The thinking went: a well-treated prisoner who returns home with stories of American abundance and fairness becomes a weapon against Nazi propaganda. A starved, brutalized prisoner becomes a martyr for the Reich. By 1944, this program intensified. Prisoners identified as hardcore Nazis were separated into special camps. Alva, Oklahoma became one such facility. The rest underwent subtle, persistent exposure to American ideas. American prosperity, American normalcy. Alex Funk, a German military chaplain held at Camp Algona in Iowa, wrote, after the war, "We all were positively impressed by the us and we all had been won over to friendly relations with America. But single sentence reveals the success of the entire enterprise. But not everything was peaceful. Golden cage comfort. Pro-Nazi prisoners sometimes enforced their own brutal discipline within camps. Several POs were murdered by fellow prisoners for being too friendly with Americans or for anti-Nazi sentiments. At Camp Concordia, one prisoner declared that a good German would not help the Americans. He was quickly transferred. Work slowdowns occasionally occurred. The punishment was typically several days of solitary confinement with only bread and water, the harshest penalty allowed under Geneva rules, and still far better than what Wehrmacht military justice would have dispensed for similar offenses. And there were escape attempts, though far fewer than you might expect. Of 425,000 German POS in the United States during the war, only 2,222, less than 1%, attempted escape. Most were recaptured within days. Where would they go? A German speaker in rural Kansas stuck out like a spotlight. No support network existed. Mexico was too far. The Atlantic was an ocean away. One man, though, would beat the odds in the most spectacular way possible. Georg Gertner, captured with the Afrika Korps, was held at Camp Deming in New Mexico. In September 1945, just after VJ Day, he slipped through the fence and hopped onto a moving freight train. Unlike others who'd tried and failed, Gertner didn't immediately seek to return to Germany. He disappeared into America itself. For the next 40 years, he lived under the assumed name Dennis Wiles, working as a ski instructor in California, Hawaii, and Colorado. He learned perfect English, built a life, became, in many ways, more American than German. The FBI searched for him for decades, but Gertner understood something crucial. He could hide in plain sight because America was vast, anonymous, and fundamentally unbothered by one more working man with a slight accent. When he finally turned himself in on September 11, 1985, exactly 40 years after his escape, he explained simply, "I wanted to stay in America. It seemed like a better life than what waited for me in Germany." He became known as Hitler's last soldier in America, but that title misunderstood everything about Gertner's story. He wasn't loyal to Hitler. He was loyal to the life he'd glimpsed during his imprisonment, the abundance, the opportunity, the freedom from war. And he wasn't alone in that realization. By 1945, as camps prepared for repatriation, a profound shift had occurred in the minds of thousands of people. They'd seen American farms producing yields that seemed impossible. They'd watched American trucks and trains move with casual efficiency. They'd experienced a society that, even under wartime rationing, operated with a material surplus they'd never witnessed. One prisoner at Camp Algona remarked, "We understood, finally, that we had lost, not because our soldiers were less brave, but because we were fighting a country that could afford to send prisoners fresh oranges." That sentence captures something essential about the American POW experience. The revelation that Germany had been fighting a war it could never win, not due to strategy or courage, but due to sheer overwhelming material reality. But the real reckoning would come when these men went home. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. V-Day brought celebrations across America, but in the POW camps it brought uncertainty. What happens now? Under Geneva Convention rules and agreements between the Allies, POWs were to be repatriated to their home countries as soon as practical after hostilities ended. But practical was a complicated word in 1945. Europe was devastated. Transportation infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of displaced persons needed movement. The Allied occupation forces needed logistical capacity. So the German prisoners stayed. Through the summer of 1945, through the autumn, through the winter, they worked the same farms, lived in the same camps, ate the same meals. But everything had changed, because now they knew what waited for them at home. Letters from Germany. When they came painted a horrifying picture. Cities were rubble. Food was scarce beyond anything even the wartime shortages had caused. The occupation zones were chaotic. The Morgenthau Plan, briefly considered by the Allies, would have reduced Germany to a pre-industrial agricultural state. Though that plan was abandoned, the fear of it hung in the air. And then the films arrived in camp after camp across America. Allied officials showed German POS footage of concentration camps Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, Buchenwald, the piles of corpses, the skeletal survivors, the gas chambers, the crematoria. A photograph exists from one such screening, showing rows of German prisoners watching, their faces a mixture of horror, disbelief, and in some cases, visible tears. Many prisoners insisted it must be propaganda. Faked impossible. Some remained convinced of this for the rest of their lives. But many others, particularly younger prisoners, who'd been conscripted late in the war, and had less ideological investment in the Reichs, felt the foundation of everything they'd been told begin to crack. Werner Burkhardt, a prisoner at Camp Hearn in Texas, wrote years later, "I watched that film and I understood that I had been part of something monstrous. Not directly, I was a tank driver, I shot at other tanks, I never set foot in Poland or saw a camp, but part of it nonetheless. That knowledge changed me." The combination of American treatment and German revelation created a psychological crisis for many people. They'd spent months or years being treated humanely by people they'd been taught were subhuman degenerates. They'd experienced abundance from a nation they'd been told was weak and decadent. And now they learned that the regime they'd served had committed atrocities on an industrial scale. For some, it led to a complete ideological rejection of Nazism. For others, compartmentalization they hadn't known. They'd just been soldiers following orders. It wasn't their fault. For still others, denial or deflection, the concentration camps were propaganda. Or they were exaggerated. Or the Allies had committed similar crimes that just weren't being shown. But regardless of individual response, the camps buzzed with debate, argument, and reckoning. And through it all, the Americans kept feeding them. The military's re-education program intensified in this period. The Special Projects Division identified prisoners most amenable to democratic ideas and gave them leadership roles within camps. They provided newspapers, books, magazines, They brought in German-American speakers to discuss democracy, freedom of speech, civilian government. At Camp Concordia, educational programs expanded. Prisoners attended lectures on American history, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Some were skeptical, others were genuinely interested. A few had their entire worldview transformed. By early 1946, repatriation finally began in earnest. The process was gradual, complex, bureaucratic. Some prisoners were sent to France or Britain first, to work on reconstruction before returning to Germany. Others went directly home. Very few found ways to remain in America, though this was officially prohibited. The ships that carried them back were crowded, like the ships that had brought them, but this time, the prisoners carried with them 3 years of physical weight from American meals. Yes, but also psychological weight from what they'd experienced and learned. When the first returnees arrived in Germany in spring 1946, they found a country even worse than the letters had suggested. Hamburg was 50% destroyed. Berlin was a moonscape of rubble. Dresden had been firebombed into oblivion. Munich, Frankfurt, Cologne, every major city bore catastrophic damage. The German economy had collapsed. Hyperinflation loomed. Food rations were below starvation levels in many areas. The contrast with America was so stark it seemed unreal, like they'd stepped between different worlds. Hans Wecht, the POW, who later became a physician in Maine, recalled arriving in Bremen. I stepped off the ship and saw German people. My people digging through garbage for food. Children with distended bellies from malnutrition. Women trading family heirlooms for a loaf of bread. I had just left a place where prisoners of war ate better than these civilians. It was incomprehensible. Many returning POS tried to help. The Luchens family in Nebraska, who'd employed German prisoners on their farm, maintained correspondence with several of them after repatriation. They sent care packages, food, clothing, soap, small luxuries. Other American families did the same. These acts of kindness, from civilians who could have justifiably hated the enemy soldiers, represented yet another shock to prisoners' worldviews. Why would Americans help them? Why would families who'd sent their own sons to fight in Europe now send packages to German soldiers who'd fought against them? The answer lay in a distinctly American pragmatism mixed with religious charity. Many rural American families saw the POWs not as abstract Nazis but as young men far from home. They'd worked alongside them, shared meals, learned their names. That personal connection transcended ideology, but it also reflected something deeper: American confidence. A nation secure in its victory can afford generosity. A nation drowning in abundance can afford to share. America, in 1945-1946, was ascendant, undamaged, flush with industrial capacity, and agricultural surplus. The prisoners represented no threat. Helping them cost little and perhaps built goodwill for the coming Cold War. Some prisoners never returned to Germany. Finding legal pathways to stay was nearly impossible. But a handful managed it. Others, like Georg Gertner, simply disappeared into the American landscape. By some estimates, as many as 5,000 German POS remained in the United States after the war, through various means, some legal, many not. For those who did return, the experience shaped them permanently. Many became advocates for German-American friendship in the post-war years. Some entered politics, explicitly pro-Western and pro-democracy. Others simply carried the memory privately. A secret comparison between what they'd seen in America and what they'd been told about America. Alex Funk, the chaplain from Camp Algona, wrote in 1947, "We were enemies when we arrived in the United States. We were better men when we left. That is the power of treating humans with dignity, even humans who have been your foes." The American POW camps worked. In other words, not as prisons designed merely to contain, but as unintentional ambassadors for American values. The prisoners weren't won over by speeches or propaganda. They were won over by coffee, showers, hot meals, fair wages, and the realization that everything they'd been told about their enemy was wrong. This wasn't inevitable. It was policy, carefully calculated and implemented. The United States could have treated German prisoners harshly. There was certainly public appetite for it. But military and political leaders understood something crucial. The war would end, but the peace would require these men to return to Germany and build something new. Better they return with positive memories of America than with fresh grievances to nurse. In that sense, the POW camps were the first battle of the Cold War, fought not with weapons but with bacon and eggs. By the end of 1946, the camps were empty. The last German POS boarded ships for Europe in December. The facilities were dismantled, converted back to their original purposes, or abandoned to decay. Camp Concordia, which had held over 4,000 prisoners at its peak, closed its gates. Today a small museum preserves its memory, but the barracks are gone, the fences pulled down, the guard towers demolished. Where prisoners once played soccer and attended classes, Kansas wheat now grows. Similar patterns repeated across the country. In Nebraska, Iowa, Texas, California everywhere, the camps had been, the physical traces faded quickly, but the human connections persisted. Mel Lutyens, the Nebraska farm boy who'd befriended German workers, maintained correspondence with several of them for decades. In the 1960s, he and his parents traveled to Germany and met former POWs in their homes, sharing meals and memories. The visit was emotional for all involved, former enemies embracing as old friends. They showed us around their towns, Lutyens recalled years later. We saw how they'd rebuilt. Many of them had prospered in the post-war years. They attributed some of that success to lessons learned in America about efficiency, about mechanization, about how to run a business. It was remarkable. Kelly Holthus, who'd seen prisoners working across the road from his family's York, Nebraska home, echoed this sentiment. Years later, I realized that those men went home and probably helped rebuild Germany with the same values they'd seen here. They'd experienced democracy without even knowing it, fair wages, decent treatment, dignity. That had to have an impact. Not all the stories ended positively. Some POWs struggled terribly upon repatriation. The psychological whiplash from abundance to deprivation broke some men. A few committed suicide. Others turned bitter, blaming America for the disparity, even as they'd benefited from it. Human psychology is complex, and gratitude doesn't always survive the contrast between past comfort and present suffering. But the overall pattern held. German POWs who'd experienced American camps disproportionately became advocates for Western values in post-war Germany. Hans Wecker exemplified this trajectory. After struggling in the immediate post-war years, he managed to emigrate to the United States in the 1950s. He attended medical school, became a physician, and practiced in Maine for decades. In interviews late in his life, he spoke of his POW experience as transformative, not just in practical terms, but in his entire understanding of governance, society, and human potential. I was captured thinking America was my enemy, he said. I was repatriated knowing Germany had been my enemy all along, or at least the Germany of Hitler. I saw in America a model for what Germany could become, and to some extent, it did. He wasn't wrong. West Germany's post-war democracy, its economic miracle, its integration into NATO and the Western Alliance, all of this happened in part because hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians had direct experience with American life, American values, and American generosity. The POW camps were a tiny piece of that larger story, but they were a piece nonetheless. What about Georg Gertner, Hitler's last soldier? After 40 years in hiding, Gertner emerged in 1985 not to a hero's welcome or a villain's prosecution, but to the statute of limitations had long passed. He'd committed no crimes beyond the initial escape. The government saw no point in pursuing an 83-year-old man who'd become more American than many native-born citizens. Gertner gave interviews, wrote a book, and lived out his remaining years in modest comfort. He died in 2013, at age 97, having spent nearly 70 years in the country that had once held him prisoner. In one interview, he was asked whether he regretted escaping. His answer: I regret the war. I regret the Hitler years, but escaping to America, that was the best decision I ever made. I found freedom by staying in the place that captured me. There's irony in that, but there's also truth. As for the broader question, did any German POWs stay legally? The answer is surprisingly complex. A small number received permission to emigrate in the 1950s through family sponsorships or skilled labor programs. Many more maintained connections to America through correspondence, business relationships, or later tourism. And yes, an unknown number simply never left, disappearing into the vast American landscape with new identities and new lives. The government estimates suggest around 5,000 former POWs may have remained in the U.S. by various means. Most were never caught. Many lived ordinary law-abiding lives, married American women, raised American children, and became productive members of society. Their secret German past faded into family lore. Grandpa had an accent and never talked about the old country. For the remaining 420,000 who returned to Germany, the impact was more diffuse but no less real. They carried stories that contradicted official propaganda, that challenged nationalist myths, that demonstrated American power wasn't just military but economic, social, cultural. Those stories, told in pubs and living rooms across post-war Germany, became part of the foundation on which reconciliation was built. Here's the uncomfortable truth that German prisoners confronted in American camps. They'd been fighting a war they could never win. Not because German soldiers were less brave, they weren't. Not because German tactics were inferior, in many cases, they were superior. But because Germany was fighting a nation that could afford to feed prisoners fresh oranges while simultaneously building the largest military machine in human history. The coffee, the showers, the fresh bread, these weren't just amenities. They were evidence of an economic system that could produce abundance even under wartime strain. Evidence of a political system stable enough to treat enemies humanely. Evidence of a society confident enough to be generous with those who'd tried to destroy it. German prisoners had been told Americans were weak, decadent, mongrelized, incapable of sustained effort. What they discovered was a nation so overwhelmingly powerful it could defeat Germany almost casually. As an afterthought, while also fighting Japan, this wasn't the lesson the US military intended to teach. Exactly. The camps existed primarily to solve logistical problems: where to put prisoners, how to fill labor shortages. But in solving those practical problems, America accidentally demonstrated the fundamental disparity that determined the war's outcome. You can't beat a country that has so much it can afford to treat its prisoners better than you treat your own soldiers. There's a broader lesson here about how wars are really won. We focus on battles, on generals, on tactics and strategy. But beneath all that lies the boring stuff: industrial capacity, agricultural output, resource access, transportation infrastructure, the ability to keep your army fed, equipped, moving, supplied. Germany lost World War II in the factories of Detroit and the wheat fields of Kansas long before Stalingrad or Normandy. The POW camps just made that truth visible to the men who'd been asked to fight an unwinnable war. Today, virtually all those prisoners are gone. The last survivors are in their late 90s or beyond 100. Their stories fade with them. But the precedent they set, treating enemies with dignity, using soft power alongside hard power, investing in future peace during present war, remains relevant. The United States has struggled with this in subsequent conflicts. Guantanamo Bay represents a rejection of the Geneva principles that governed the World War II camps. Abu Ghraib showed what happens when those principles are abandoned. The contrast with the treatment of German POS is stark and telling. Maybe we've forgotten what those camps proved: that victory isn't just about defeating the enemy, but about what kind of nation you are when you've won. The German prisoners who wept at their first American meal weren't weeping from gratitude. They were weeping because they suddenly understood how completely they'd lost, how thoroughly they'd been lied to, and how different the world was from what they'd been taught. That moment of realization, more than any battle, was the beginning of Germany's transformation from enemy to ally. It started with a cup of real coffee.